All right, let's jump straight into this explainer. Project Westward, the Great Copper Needle Belt. You know, when we look back at the 1960s, we usually think of the space race, right? Moon landings, astronauts, all that glory. But today, we're looking at one of the most bizarre, totally over-the-top engineering projects of the entire Cold War. It's a deeply ambitious and honestly kind of weird chapter of history that almost always gets left out of the textbooks.
So here's a question for you. Why on earth did the U.S. put 480 million needles into the sky? Think about the Seattle Space Needle for a second. Built in 1961, iconic feat of engineering, but let's be real, limited practical use. Well, if you're into impressively engineered space needles with even less practical use, Seattle isn't number one. Because the United States government actually decided the absolute best way to secure their communication networks was to literally shoot hundreds of millions of tiny, sharp metal needles directly into orbit. No, seriously.
480 million. Just try to wrap your head around that number for a second. 480 million of anything is a lot, let alone metal projectiles hurtling through space. But this was the reality of Project Westward. It's the kind of wild idea that only gets greenlit because of that intense, paranoid, will-they-won't-they total annihilation vibe going on between the US and the USSR. Instead of just building more underground bunkers, they express their extreme Cold War stress in some highly unorthodox ways. Like, filling the sky with shiny metal objects.
Which brings us to part one, Cold War communication fears, the fragility of staying connected. Because to understand why anyone would think shooting needles into space was a good idea, we really have to look at the massive vulnerabilities the military was dealing with back then. See, before the dawn of modern satellites, the US basically had just two ways to talk across the ocean. First up, undersea cables. The problem there? Way too vulnerable. The military was genuinely losing sleep imagining a Soviet submarine just cruising along the ocean floor with a pair of giant scissors ready to snip the line. So their backup was over-the-horizon, or OTH, radio. Now, OTH works by bouncing signals off the ionosphere. That's a layer of charged particles, like 100 to 300 kilometers up. But man, this method was incredibly fickle. The crucial thing to understand here is that the ionosphere isn't just some permanent, reliable bounce pad in the sky. It's constantly changing. It gets messed up by unpredictable stuff like solar flares, nuclear tests, and high-altitude disturbances. In the 50s and 60s, the military was absolutely terrified of a specific worst-case scenario. Imagine this, a perfectly timed solar storm wipes out the radio signals at the exact same moment an enemy cuts those undersea cables. Boom! The entire long-range communication system is completely dead. They desperately needed a backup plan that couldn't be snipped and couldn't be blown away by the sun.
Enter Part 2, the artificial copper ionosphere, a brilliant and bizarre solution. This was their big answer to that terrifying vulnerability.
And this is where Project Westward is born. The plan was simultaneously super simple and just deeply, deeply ambitious. If the natural ionosphere is too flaky, let's just build an artificial one. The US decided they would put a massive ring of copper wires into orbit around the planet. These needles would act as a highly consistent, giant dipole antenna specifically tuned for 8 gigahertz radio signals. And we aren't talking about random scraps of metal here. Each individual needle was precisely engineered to be exactly 1.8 centimeters long.
Okay, so how do you actually get hundreds of millions of needles up there? It's fascinating. Step 1. They built a dispersal machine. And I kid you not, this absolutely vital piece of top-secret military tech was about the length and width of a standard wiener dog. It carried a canister packed with these tiny needles, all entirely encased in a naphthalene gel. Step 2. This little machine gets into orbit, and the sheer heat of the sun slowly melts that gel away. Step 3. The needles gradually scatter. The theory was that, within a few weeks, the Earth would have this shiny, brand-new copper ring around it. I know, it sounds exactly like a goofy sci-fi heist movie, but this was a completely serious, top-level military operation.
All right, moving on to Section 3, Success and Global Backlash, a 10th Triumph. Because, as you might guess, throwing hundreds of millions of objects into orbit didn't go flawlessly on day one.
Their very first attempt at 1961? Total failure. The release mechanism malfunctioned, and the needles just didn't deploy properly. But, they went back to the drawing board and tried again in May of 1963, and this time it actually worked. Over the course of about 40 days, a full belt formed and a polar orbit. And shortly after that, the US military successfully sent voice transmissions all the way from Massachusetts to California just by bouncing the signal right off their brand new space needles. For the engineers, it was a massive technological triumph.
However, that excitement was definitely not a global feeling. While the US military was basically saying whoopee, the rest of the world was, well, rightfully uncomfortable. Think about it. The US had just successfully built a giant metal ring around the entire Earth. The international reaction was incredibly swift, and it was angry.
So why did everyone hate this so much? First off, astronomers were absolutely furious. They were terrified that a permanent belt of conductive metal was going to completely ruin their telescopes and just block their view of the cosmos. On top of that, other nations were deeply miffed that the US was unilaterally deciding what to put in everyone's shared sky. Like no consent, no heads up, just needles. This global outrage got so intense that it directly triggered the creation of Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty. Basically, the international community had to get together and make it a literal legal requirement that if you ever want to go needle mode again, you have to ask the rest of the world for permission first.
Which brings us to number 4, obsolete before it finished, the sudden twist. Because honestly, the legal fallout isn't even the wildest part of this whole story.
There is a massive, hilarious twist here regarding the project's actual usefulness. By the time the US finally proved these needles actually worked in 1963, the entire project was already dead on arrival. Project Westford was this massive, messy, highly localized backup plan relying on millions of scattered needles. But meanwhile, AT&T had just launched Telstar. That marked the dawn of the world's first active communication satellites, alongside massive federal investments in satellite tech. So the needles were essentially a backup plan for a problem that got solved by vastly superior technology before the backup ring was even fully finished. Talk about bad timing.
And that leads us to our final section. Part 5. The clumpy legacy above. What remains today? So you gotta wonder, what exactly happened to those 480 million needles once the military realized they didn't actually need them anymore?
Well, spoiler alert, we certainly didn't go up there and pick them up. Nobody cleaned the mess. And here is where that wiener dog dispersal method really backfired. Remember that naphthalene gel? Because it melted in the harsh vacuum of space, instead of normal atmospheric conditions, a huge portion of those copper needles didn't scatter nicely at all. Instead, they self-welded. They literally fused together into these large, heavy clumps that are still whipping around our planet 24/7 at orbital speeds.
So where exactly are they now? Well, a large portion of the individual single needles eventually did re-enter the atmosphere, which means, hey, if you ever find yourself wandering around the North Pole, you might just be able to pan through the snow and find some vintage 1960s space copper. But we definitively know of several dozen clumps of those self-welded needles that were still in orbit as of 2013. And beyond that, there are potentially thousands of other undetected heavy clumps still up there right now. It's just a truly wacky legacy. We've got a repurposed telescope in Massachusetts, a wiener dog-sized machine sitting in a Virginia museum, and thousands of balls of copper forever orbiting our heads.
Which leaves us with this final, absolutely crucial question. As thousands of these copper clumps still whip around the Earth today, a literal physical relic of Cold War panic, who actually gets to decide what we leave in our shared sky? It's a question that started with an unorthodox wiener dog machine and 480 million tiny needles. But as our orbit gets more and more crowded with modern satellites and, frankly, space junk, it's a question that matters more right now than ever before.
Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and hey, keep looking up.